Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Today channel. Eric kicks Taylor out of the house after he discovers shocking secret. Taylor, used every Sunday, had turned to glass, each molecule frozen in a perfect, silent scream, and Eric stood at its center, a tremor running through the very foundation of his being, a seismic shock that started in the hand still clutching the manila folder and radiated outwards until he could feel it in the roots of his teeth, a vibration of pure, undiluted disbelief. It was a Tuesday, an utterly ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that blurs into the tapestry of a long marriage, and he had come home early to surprise her with tickets to the symphony, a feeble attempt to recapture a spark that had lately felt more like a pilot light flickering in a strong draft, and finding the house empty, he decided to finally clean out the spare room closet, a task Taylor had always gently fended off with a wave of her hand and a promise of next weekend. The folder was tucked behind a box of old university textbooks, its tab blank, anonymous, and yet something about its deliberate concealment, its separation from the organized files in his own office, had made his fingers clumsy as he undid the clasp, a low, atavistic dread already coiling in his gut. The contents were not a single bombshell but a cascade of them, each document meticulously dated and filed, a horrifying archive of a life lived in his shadow, a parallel existence constructed beam by beam in the secret spaces of their shared life, bank statements for an account he never knew existed, showing regular, substantial deposits from their joint savings, the very savings he had sacrificed and scrimped for, earmarked for the Mediterranean cruise they'd dreamed of in their retirement. Deeds and property taxes for a small, modest house in a town 2 hours away, a place called Millfield he'd only ever driven through, and most damningly, a sheaf of photographs, not of a lover, not of some torrid affair he might have, in some dark corner of his soul, been prepared for, but of a family. There was Taylor, her smile brighter and more unguarded than he had seen in years, her arm slung around the shoulders of a young man, maybe 18, with Eric's own chin, his own deep-set eyes, a living, breathing ghost of his own youth staring back at him from the glossy paper. And in another, she was holding a little girl on her hip, the child's cheeks round and flushed with laughter. The math was brutal and instantaneous, a sucker punch to his diaphragm, the long trip to care for her ailing aunt 5 years ago, the quiet retreat she took 3 summers back, each absence now mapped perfectly onto the milestones of this other, hidden family, this son who was undeniably, gut-wrenchingly his, conceived in some stolen moment, raised in a house his money had bought, loved with a devotion that had clearly been siphoned from his own marriage. The world telescoped down to the sharp edge of the photograph, the sound of his own blood roaring in his ears, and he was still standing there, a statue of betrayal, when the front door clicked open and Taylor called out, "Eric? Honey, are you home?" The car's in the drive, her voice, usually a sound that signaled homecoming, that could soften the edges of the worst day, now sounded like a stranger's, a lie-given breath. He didn't move, couldn't move, as her footsteps approached, light and quick, and then she was in the doorway of the spare room, her cheerful expression faltering as she took in the scene, him, the open folder in his hand, the photographs fanned out on the floor where they had slipped from his numb fingers. The color drained from her face so completely it was as if someone had pulled a plug, leaving her wan and suddenly ancient, her carefully maintained facade crumbling into dust in the space of a single heartbeat. "Eric," she whispered, and it was not a greeting but a plea, a confession, a sound of such profound and terminal understanding that it sucked all the oxygen from the room. "Who is he?" Eric's voice was not his own, it was a low, gravelly thing, stripped of all emotion, all the fire of his rage momentarily banked by the sheer, staggering weight of the truth. Taylor flinched as if he'd struck her, her hands fluttering uselessly at her sides before she wrapped her arms around herself, a pathetic attempt at self-containment. His name is Leo," she said, the words barely audible, and then the story, a torrent of desperate, fractured explanations, began to spill out, a brief, reckless affair in a period of their marriage she had felt lonely. Invisible, a mistake that had consequences, the terrifying discovery of the pregnancy, the impossible choice she felt she had to make alone, and then, seeing the child, her love for him, the need to protect him, to provide for him, building the second life, the constant, grinding fear of discovery, the lies piling up until they became a fortress around her. She spoke of love, for him, for Eric, and for the son he never knew, a love she claimed was not divided but multiplied, but to Eric, each word was another nail in the coffin of their 22 years together. He listened, his face a mask of granite, until she finally fell silent, her body shaking with silent sobs, her eyes begging for an absence he could not, would not, ever grant. "Get out," he said, the words flat and final, a decree. Taylor stared, uncomprehending for a moment, as if the simplicity of the command was too complex to process. What? "Eric, please, let's talk, let me explain properly." "You have explained," he interrupted, his voice gaining a sharp, dangerous edge. "You have explained for 18 years. You have explained with my money, in a house my labor paid for, with a son who should have been mine. There are no more explanations. There is nothing left to say. Get out of my house." He emphasized the word a weapon. This was no longer theirs. It was a crime scene, and she was the perpetrator. The life they had built was a set, a facade, and he had just seen the scaffolding. "Where will I go?" she whispered, a practical question in the face of total annihilation. "I assume you have another home," he replied, the iciness in his tone so profound it seemed to frost the windows. "Go to Millfield. Go to your son. Get your things and go. Now." There was no negotiation in his tone, no crack through which a future conversation might slip. This was not an argument, it was an eviction. He watched, his soul encased in permafrost, as she moved through the motions of departure, her movements slow and jerky as if she were a marionette with its strings cut, stuffing a small suitcase with a few essentials, her hands trembling so violently she could barely zip it closed. She paused at the front door, one last, desperate look over her shoulder, a silent appeal to a history that had just been proven false, a shared mythology now exposed as a fraud. Eric met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw no trace of the man who had loved her, who had shared his bed, his dreams, his life. She saw only a vast, implacable emptiness. The door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click, a sound infinitely more devastating than a slam, and Eric was alone in the terrible, echoing silence of the house, the ghost of her lemon polish still hanging in the air, now smelling only of poison and deceit, the weight of 1,000 yesterdays collapsing upon him, each cherished memory now reclassified as a lie, each laugh a performance, each touch a betrayal, the entire architecture of his life revealed as a carefully constructed fiction, leaving him standing amidst the ruins, a king dethroned in a kingdom that never was. Eric decides to reveal the biggest secret about Taylor. Eric had carried for 15 years, a secret that was not his to keep but had become his to bear, a lodestone of guilt and loyalty that had shaped the contours of his life, bending every decision, every relationship, around its immense, hidden gravity. He stood now, not as the successful architect he had become, with his clean lines and soaring, transparent structures, but as the boy he had been, trembling slightly in the cool, dusty dimness, facing his oldest friend, Taylor, whose entire existence, whose globally adored persona, was a magnificent edifice built upon the foundation of a single, beautiful lie that Eric was about to dismantle with nothing but the truth. Taylor, whose name was synonymous with raw, autobiographical authenticity, whose lyrics were pored over by millions as sacred texts that chronicled a life of public heartbreak and private triumph, watched him with a curious, affectionate smile, unaware that the ground upon which they both stood was seconds from crumbling into dust. "Do you remember that summer?" Eric began, his voice not the confident baritone he used in boardrooms, but the hesitant, reedy echo of his 16-year-old self, the summer after junior year, when we painted this old dinghy that terrifying shade of orange and swore we'd sail it to the other side of the lake and never come back. Taylor's laugh was a warm, familiar sound that cracked something open inside Eric's chest. "Of course I do. We got about 50 feet out and it started taking on water. We had to swim back, towing our doomed vessel behind us." Eric nodded, his eyes fixed on a knot in the wood grain just past Taylor's shoulder, a focal point for his courage. "And do you remember what you said to me, treading water out there, with the sun setting behind you? You said the lake felt like forgiveness. You said you finally understood what it meant to feel clean." He paused, the memory so vivid he could feel the chill of the water on his skin. And that night, back in this boathouse, shivering and wrapped in those awful, musty towels, you wrote it down. In that black and white composition notebook you always carried. You wrote the first verse of what would become Lake of Glass. A shadow of confusion, then a flicker of pride, passed over Taylor's face. The first song on the first album. The one that started it all. You know that's always been our song, our story. That's what everyone thinks, Eric whispered, the words hanging in the silent air between them, charged and terrible. That's what I've let everyone think for 15 years. He finally forced himself to meet Taylor's gaze, and in that moment, he saw the first genuine flicker of unease. But that's not how it happened, Taylor. You didn't write those words. Not then. Not that night. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the gentle lap of water against the dock pilings outside. Eric took a shaky breath, plunging into the abyss he had spent a decade and a half avoiding. You fell asleep. Exhausted from the swim. And I couldn't sleep. I was buzzing with it all, the cold water, the adventure, the way you'd looked out at the horizon. I picked up your notebook. And I just started writing. It was a letter, almost. To you. About that day. About our friendship. It was messy and raw and full of all the things I never had the courage to say out loud. He could see the denial forming in Taylor's eyes, a defensive wall slamming down. That's not true. I remember writing it. I have the notebook, the original. You have the notebook I slipped into your backpack the next morning, Eric said, his voice gaining a terrible, steady strength now that the truth was finally free. After I'd filled 2 pages. You woke up, saw it, and your face just lit up. You said, Eric, this is it. This is a song. And you started humming a melody, right there. It was magic. And I was so happy for you, so in awe of what you could do with my clumsy words, that I let you have them. I said, yeah, you must have written it in your sleep, and we laughed. And then you played it for everyone, and they loved it, and the look on your face. I couldn't take it back. It was the key that unlocked everything for you. Your confidence, your voice, your career. Every hit that followed, every Grammy, every stadium tour, it was built on that one moment. On my words. The revelation landed not with a dramatic crash, but with a suffocating, silent implosion. Taylor's face, usually so expressive and open under the spotlight, was a terrifying blank mask, the persona receding to reveal the stunned, vulnerable human beneath. The carefully curated myth of the prodigious singer-songwriter who had burst onto the scene fully formed at 17 with a perfectly penned anthem of youth and longing, a myth endorsed by documentaries, magazine profiles, and Taylor's own unwavering testimony, was evaporating before them. You're lying, Taylor finally breathed, the words devoid of conviction, a hollow automatic response. Why would you say this? Why now? Because my silence has become a lie bigger than the truth ever was, Eric said, tears welling in his eyes for the first time, not of guilt, but of relief. I have watched you become a god, Taylor, and I have loved you for it, and I have hated myself for my part in the fraud. Every time you introduced that song on stage as the moment you found your voice, it was like a knife twisting in me. Not because I wanted the credit, God, no, I never wanted the fame, the scrutiny, but because the voice you found was built on a silence. My silence. Our secret. And it poisoned everything. I could never have a real friendship with anyone because I was keeping this planet-sized secret. I could never truly celebrate your success because I felt like a ghost at the feast. I built my career on creating structures of integrity, things that are honest and true and will stand for 100 years, while living a life that was fundamentally dishonest. I am crumbling inside, and I can't do it anymore. I am so sorry. I am so sorry for not telling you then, and for telling you now, and for every moment in between. He fell silent, his confession complete, the massive, hidden burden finally transferred from his shoulders and laid at the feet of his friend, its sheer size and ugliness now visible in the dusty light. He had not done it for money, or for revenge, or for fame. He had done it for the simplest and most profound reason of all, to finally be able to look his oldest friend in the eye and see them, and not the ghost of the lie that stood between them. He had done it to be free, even if that freedom cost him everything. Taylor was silent for a long time, staring at the floorboards where they had once sat as kids, dreaming dreams that had, in a twisted way, come true. The persona of the global icon was gone, completely stripped away. In its place was just a person, grappling with the violent rewriting of their own history. And then, something unexpected happened. Taylor looked up, and instead of the betrayal or the fury Eric had braced for, he saw a dawning, devastating empathy. "All this time," Taylor said, the voice soft, stripped of its performative power. "All this time, you carried that for me." It was the last reaction Eric had expected. Forgiveness, perhaps. Anger, definitely. But not this aching understanding. "The song was never the source, Eric," Taylor continued, slowly, working it out in real time. "It was the key, just like you said. But the source was always that day. That feeling. Our feeling. You just gave it words first. I built everything on the truth of that moment on the lake, not the words in the notebook. The words just showed me how to get it out." Taylor took a step forward, the distance between them feeling like a chasm that was slowly closing. "You think you gave me a lie. But you gave me a mirror. And I spent 15 years looking into it, thinking I was looking at myself, when all along, I was looking at you." The secret was out. It was no longer a hidden bomb but a revealed scar, a shared wound. It would change everything, their friendship, Taylor's legacy, everything. But as Eric stood there, raw and exposed, he saw not an ending, but a terrifying and authentic new beginning. The biggest secret was no longer a weight. It was just a story. And for the first time in 15 years, it was finally theirs to tell together. Eric, a person we thought we knew, a man whose laughter had once felt like a genuine and safe haven, could commit such a profound and calculated act of cruelty against Taylor, a woman whose inherent grace and quiet strength seemed to invite protection rather than predation, is a cognitive and emotional earthquake that shatters the very bedrock of one's perception of reality, character, and the fundamental rules of human decency, forcing us to confront the terrifying chasm that can exist between the meticulously constructed public persona and the shadowed, hidden self that operates with such chilling indifference to the wreckage it causes, a betrayal that is not a single, solitary event but a bomb that detonates in the past, present, and future simultaneously, retroactively poisoning every cherished memory, every shared joke, every moment of vulnerability Taylor offered him in good faith, now exposed as a grotesque parody of intimacy performed for an audience of one, a con artist of the heart who was taking notes on her trust not to cherish it but to exploit it, making the present moment a waking nightmare of nausea and disorientation where the world loses its color and its logic, where the simple act of breathing feels like a betrayal of one's own body for not having sensed the danger, for not having screamed a silent alarm when in his presence, and casting a long, dark, and suffocating shadow over Taylor's future, a future where her ability to trust not just men, but her own judgment, the very intuition that is meant to be her internal compass, has been violently dismantled, leaving her to navigate a world that suddenly feels bristling with hidden threats and false smiles, where every kind gesture is suspect and every potential connection must first be vetted through the paralyzing lens of this fresh trauma, a pain that is compounded exponentially by the social fallout, the whispers and the inevitable, vile debates that seek to minimize his actions or, worse, implicate her in her own victimization, the classic and cruel rhetoric of "what was she wearing?" Or "why was she there?" Or "they seemed so happy, are we sure it's not a misunderstanding?" All insidious questions designed to create a semblance of order from chaos by falsely assigning blame to the one person who is blameless, because it is far less terrifying to believe that victims make preventable mistakes than to accept the horrifying truth that sometimes, monsters don't lurk under the bed but stand in broad daylight, smiling, holding a door open, remembered as a great boyfriend or a reliable friend, their evil so mundane and so seamlessly integrated into the everyday that it becomes invisible until it strikes, and this collective disbelief from the periphery, from mutual friends who struggle to reconcile the Eric they knew at the barbecue with the Eric capable of such a vile act, often results in a torturous pressure on Taylor to provide ever more proof, to relive her horror in minute detail to satisfy their incredulity. A second violation that demands her pain be performative and palatable enough to justify their revocation of his social license, a process that is exhausting and re-traumatizing, forcing her to become a relentless advocate for her own suffering in a court of public opinion that should never have been convened, all while Eric, the architect of this devastation, often gets to retreat into a silence that his enablers may call dignified but is, in reality, a cowardly refusal to account for the atomic bomb he detonated in another human being's life. And this imbalance, her very public anguish versus his shielded privacy, feels like a final, insulting twist of the knife, a societal failure that prioritizes the comfort of the collective and the reputation of the perpetrator over the desperate need for justice and validation of the survivor, who is left to pick up the shattered pieces of her identity alone, tasked with the Herculean effort of rebuilding a self that can once again feel safe inside its own skin, a process that has no timeline and no map, where a scent, a song, a turn of phrase he used, can trigger a flashback that drops her right back into the moment of violation, a psychic wound that time alone cannot heal, only scab over, always vulnerable to being torn open by a memory or a careless comment from someone who doesn't know the story. And this is the true horror of what Eric has done. It is a gift that keeps on taking, a theft not of a single moment but of her sense of security, her peace, her ability to live in the unself-conscious present.